Oliver. Okay, so I'm gonna attempt something really difficult here. I'm gonna try to distill one of the most complex topics, which is food forest design, down into the most practical, basic steps that anyone can follow. So we'll see if I can pull it off. You let me know. If you just stumbled onto my channel, hi, I'm Levi. I've got about 12 years of experience as a novice homesteader at my living laboratory in northern Michigan that I like to call Realize Homestead. So you've probably heard of the different layers of a food forest. Sometimes they say there's 7 layers or 9 layers. But for this first pass at the design, I recommend just starting by focusing on the main canopy layers. So basically we've got our main canopy, the biggest, tallest trees. Then we've got our subcanopy species, our medium-sized trees, and the shrub species. These are kind of like the backbone of your ecosystem that you're planting. And while they're really tiny and small, they're not going to create much shade or do much soil building work. But over time, as these canopy species grow, they're going to create a whole different microclimate underneath them. They're going to start creating a little bit of a buffer from the wind and from temperature extremes. If you have bare soil like this and the sun's beating down on it, the temperature swings are going to be way higher than even just having a small cover of vegetation. That's going to be much more habitable to the understory species. And you'll probably notice that this video is a lot less polished than my other ones. Right now, the weather's warming up and I gotta spend more of my time out in the garden. As I mentioned in another video, kind of the first step is to have a good understanding of your site conditions. You go through a process that's called site analysis. Let's create kind of a model site. So here's the road, here's a stream, native forest as you can see, and the orange lines represent the slope. And the bigger they are, the steeper the slope. So first question is, where might be a good place for a house? In terms of slope, generally hills look like this. This is going to be a side view. So this, not a smart place because that's a flood zone. This, not a smart place because of winds and having to carry materials up that high. So the mid slopes are generally the ideal spot for settlements. So I'm going to put our model imaginary settlement here. And remember, I'm showing a house, but really it's a settlement with shelters, so they can all share the same infrastructure and utilities, and they can, cooperate and work together to manage or steward this site. That's going to be a lot more resilient than just one single family or just one person. And there's a few different models I've read about. I don't have a ton of experience here, but for land ownership is land trusts, something to look into if you want. And I'll also say that while this whole video is kind of demonstrated on a large scale piece of property, but all these design concepts I'm sharing can be scaled down to much smaller properties or scaled up to larger properties as well. It's just easiest to demonstrate all the different principles and ideas on a larger demonstration. And all the specific choices you make should be highly dependent on your own site conditions and all your local factors as well. Okay, so now you've got a general sense of your site. You're also going to look at the soil, right? Where there's good soil, where the soil is not so good. Probably the soil like right around the stream here is going to be very good soil because water gives life, vegetation lives and dies and lives and dies. It builds up the soil in these wet areas. And then the steepest parts are probably going to have poorer soil because of erosion, unless they're forested. Then it could be very good soil. And also nutrients are carried by water. So wildlife is peeing and pooping up here on the hill. Those nutrients are going to be carried down again into these kind of low-lying areas by the creek. So that is a sink. We call that a sink. There's sources and sinks. All right, so let's say you've done your site analysis. And this is not everything. I'm just trying to keep this really simple. When you look at a specific plant, so we're going to zoom in here for a moment, we're going to do what's called a niche analysis to understand what niche that species wants to grow in or will thrive in, will do the best in. There's tons of details you can look into. I'm going to simplify it to just a few main ones. So there's the zone, growing zone, the USDA growing zone. So this would be like 3 through 9, for example. Then there's sun preference. You've either got full sun, part sun, or full shade. Most plants are going to prefer either full sun or part sun. So full sun is like 6 hours or more of direct sunlight per day. Partial sun is maybe just a few hours of direct sun a day, or it's like very dappled shade. So these are kind of like its preferences. And you've got soil. There could be things like more acidic soil or more basic soil. But generally, I'm going to simplify this and just say you've either got, dry, moist, or wet. And the difference between moist and wet, the way I think about this, wet means it is continuously basically waterlogged. So that's like a wetland. So that the only place on this site that would be actually wet soil would be right along the stream bank here. Or if there's like a gray water thing that we're draining from the house that's just constantly getting fed from our sinks, that could be wet soil too. Moist would be essentially the soil that's getting watered. Now, if you just are out here and it's not getting watered, then that's going to probably be dry conditions. So your garden would be a good example of moist soil. Your garden soil is not wet. It's not waterlogged all the time, but you're watering it pretty much, every day or every few days. So it keeps the soil moist. And most plants, again, are going to do their best in moist soil. So that's what we got for our American plum. Then you want to know the height. And so the mature height is about 20 feet for the American plum. I should put this. And you can also get the spread, but generally it's pretty close to the height. So, it might be 25 or something. And that's at maturity. Oh, and then what do they actually produce? So like this one has fruit. That's the main yield both for wildlife and for humans, the American plum. Okay, you want to have your basic niche analysis, or this basic understanding of the needs of each species before you plant it or when you're deciding where to plant it. So for example, for this American plum, some places you would not plant it would be deep in the understory of the mature forest here. And then it's not a wetland plant, so you wouldn't want to plant it necessarily right in with its feet in the water, right next to the creek. It could be a little ways up from the creek, that might be fine. And also, if you planted it out in the super, super dry conditions and you didn't water it, it would also struggle. So there's some ideas. And if it's a 25-foot tree, remember this is north and we're in the northern hemisphere, would it make sense to plant it here? Well, in the northern hemisphere, the shadows are going to be north of the objects during most of the year. So what that means is that the once this tree becomes mature, it might be that big. And what's going to happen to that garden? They're going to get shaded out by this tree. So that's not a very good spot for it. And also, there's not a lot of room here. If we planted it right next to the house there, it would probably start running into the house, and we'd have to prune it and trim it and stuff. So might not be the best spot there either. Other things to think about are access. So if we planted it, for example, right here, just think, sometimes you might want to drive your vehicle beyond the end of the driveway and go to your back acreage over here. And so putting a tree right there that obstructs your access might not be the best move. And actually, this brings up an important concept, I think, to introduce, which I'm not going to go too deep on this right now, but it's the zones of use. You can think of it kind of like concentric circles. The lines don't really matter that much. It's just to help you conceptually understand what this is about. The zones of use just have to do with how often you visit certain places on your site, which equates to how highly managed those zones are going to be. In zone 0 inside your house, you spend most of your time inside your house, so it's going to be the most highly managed area. You're going to be very particular about every little detail inside that space. Then zone 1 is going to be the area immediately around your house. So when you're placing elements for your homestead, you want to place the elements that you are going to need to visit and go to every day right outside your house. So the zone 1 would be, I would generally place things here like my compost pile, my gardens, my hoop house, maybe an outdoor picnic area or sitting area, something like that. So that's the highest managed zone. It's going to be higher density as well. So we're not going to be planting our biggest canopy trees generally in zone 1. Then zone 2 would be things that you still are going to visit maybe every day, but you want a little bit of space, maybe because of noise or smells. So zone 2 would probably be a great place for chickens. And this is also a great place to start having your forest garden. Although zone 1 would still have forest garden elements, it's all going to be edible landscaping incorporated in here. But generally your smaller shrubs and trees. And then zone 3 is going to be even less managed stuff. So this might be larger livestock that need more land. So pigs, cows, sheep, things like that. Then getting out into zone 4, very little management. These might be things you only visit a few times a month. So that could be your mushroom logs. It could be your orchard, your sugar bush. And then zone 5 is generally considered the unmanaged zone. So that's essentially nature or the teacher. So that's just the wild, where you still will go visit it and maybe harvest things from it, but it is the most unmanaged. So the zones of use concept is really helpful when we start thinking about where to plant different things. Okay, so we talked about zones of use, and another patterned way of designing are what are called types of agroforestry. This is kind of the order I think is like easiest to implement in terms of knowledge. Oh, and by the way, that's alley cropping, not alley crapping. So the first few to me are pretty much no-brainers. You know, arriving at almost any site, I would plant the perimeter with a windbreak. We're going to assume that the boundaries of this board are basically the property lines, except right up to the road there. So maybe in front of the gardens, the windbreak gets, in the house, the windbreak gets pretty small. So there's our perimeter windbreak. You know, in terms of the general shape, yeah, you want to create this airfoil shape in a minimum of 3 rows. And if this is your height, and the wind is, let's say the wind is moving this way, then there's actually an effect, a slowing down of the wind 5 times the height, and a 15x height on the downwind side of a windbreak. 15 times the full height of the windbreak. And then another one is when you're planting them, so looking top down, instead of planting them like that, you want to stagger the rows, not rectilinear grid, but what's called tessellation. And you can also do like smaller sort of sub windbreaks further in. Maybe you want to kind of do one smaller tree species around your immediate house and garden area. So the trees we're planting here, they're not just for the purposes of stopping the wind. You know, it's going to have many different benefits. You can grow trees here that produce nuts, produce timber for building. They can grow firewood for heating your home, and as well as providing animal habitat. Oh yeah, and also in your windbreak, don't forget conifers. So, you know, white pine, nut pine trees that you can actually harvest the nuts from. Spruce, other ones like that, because your windbreak you want to still be effective in the winter, whereas deciduous trees will drop most of their leaves. Now the next thing I would do is the riparian buffer. So any waterways or bodies of water should ideally have their edges mostly planted to vegetation. And so riparian buffers are going to help, you know, any erosion or fertility or even chemicals that are running down this hill. They're going to get absorbed by this. It's basically a filtration system to keep your water clean and clear and hold the nutrients and soil on your site and digest any maybe if there is toxic chemicals. Hopefully you're not putting toxic pesticides and herbicides on your land, but if there were any, then they would get captured and digested and processed by this biological purification system. Basically, wetlands are nature's water purification systems. And so that's kind of what we're creating here. These are basically core elements to a healthy ecosystem on your land. And the final kind of no-brainer design element to me is planting out the hilltops and steep slopes to forest. Basic rule of thumb that I've read is anything that is greater than a 20-degree slope should essentially be planted out to just permanent trees, permanent forest, just because the risk of erosion and destabilization is generally too much to do a lot of agriculture on that slope, unless you're building terraces. And that's a lot of work. But we'll talk about a concept that's going to become like terraces. And then your hilltops, so that's essentially what charges your water table. So again, a little review here. So when it rains, either the water can run down the hill, in which case it starts picking up pieces of soil and sediment and carrying them down with it, creating erosion and depleting your soil there on the steep areas. Also, when the water runs over the surface, that means that it's going to run down the hill and away from your site quicker, so you're not banking or storing that water for the long term, maybe for the dry part of the season. Or it can soak in to the ground and eventually make its way to the water table. So, having as much of the rain infiltrate into your soil as possible, generally speaking, is better. There's certain conditions where you can, of course, have too much infiltration and create landslides, but that's not a worry around here where I live anyways. First, let's plant this steep hill with trees. So what happened in this situation is the rain would hit, but then as it starts running down the hill, it would get caught in all this vegetation, and then it would soak in, becoming a sponge, which will then slowly leak out throughout the whole year into the water table. And what can actually happen is, let's go and revegetate the hilltop as well. And over time, what this can do is it can actually raise the water table up, create a little spring. Basically what a spring is, when the underground water reaches the surface of the ground, then you have a spring. So planting forests uphill, especially on the hilltops, which are the headwaters of your watershed, is how you can actually create streams and rivers and have them be more stabilized. The more you plant forests and build soil, you're basically turning your whole site into a giant sponge. And that's a good thing. Okay, so those are kind of, to me, the big no-brainer agroforestry or food forest design patterns to implement on almost every site. Is going to need that just to, create the frame, you could say, for then the detailed design that we're going to get into. It's actually wild to think how in our current society, it's become normalized to remove these essential elements from the land, from the ecosystem, almost like removing your skin and just having all your organs exposed. Oh, and also think about wildlife habitat now. Now there's a lot more corridors and pathways that the wildlife can take to move through and across your site. Now, we're going to kind of zoom in into this area and talk about forest gardens. What I consider a forest garden is what a lot of people think of when they hear the word food forest. It's kind of just like a more high diversity, you're growing crops on every single layer that incorporates annual vegetables, basically a garden, into the design. So actually, forest garden could be inside our garden here. What I do is incorporate the alley cropping concept, so I'll give you a little preview. And what I like to do is alternate perennial and annual. So let's say that the dark green is perennials, the light green is annuals. So I'm already incorporating perennials into my garden. I might also incorporate some perennials on the ends, like flowers, things like fennel, yarrow, or bee balm, or calendula, other ones that would bring in beneficial insects. And then, maybe even incorporating some small species around the edges too, to again create kind of a wind buffer. And then the ones up here could be the larger shrubs. So maybe we're getting into like the hazelnuts and elderberries here, and then they get smaller as you move this way, so we're not shading out the garden. So it's kind of fading down into your smaller shrubs, things like currants, gooseberries, gumi, and so on. So again, to do a profile view, you kind of have this bowl shape effect going on. You want there to be more light coming down. And there could be, if the occasional bigger tree kind of popped in here too. But generally that's going to be kind of a canopy shape that's going to give you a lot of the benefits and trade-offs that you want. And don't forget access. We don't want to obstruct our access. So maybe you've got your little pathway and your bridge over the creek, and you've got a little pathway to your door, like so, something like that. Now, actually, that brings up another important point, access for materials. I like being able to deliver materials into different points, so you might actually make a little like entry point here, so you can dump materials over the fence and have kind of like a resource pile, for compost, wood chips, hay, whatever it is. bulk materials rather than having to take it all through this one gate entry is pretty handy. Something to think about. And then it would probably expand out, you know, just immediately around the house. So you're going to be living in the forest garden. There's going to be just edible plants all around your house. And the main thing to think about is just access paths. So you can use kind of a branching pattern. The biggest paths are vehicle, so we'll leave the vehicle access path. The next step down, the next branch down would be like wheelbarrow access, so that might just be like 2 or 3 feet wide. And then just foot only access would be the next branch down, like that. What other species would I want right immediately around my house? You know, I want my herb garden. Herbs would be incorporated, you know, either both in the garden here, and I might have an herb bed like in my landscaping here, or amongst the trees. You know, I'd want like things like onions, walking onions. I use those all the time. Apples, pears, Asian pears, plums, strawberries, stuff like that you want to just go pick on any random day and just snack on and eat. So that's the forest garden, generally zone 1, zone 2. Yeah, it can be kind of random and chaotic. Just plant them so that they don't collide with each other. You know, just a general principle for forest gardens is you want a canopy cover of maybe 40 to 60%. There should be, you know, enough light, kind of like what I drew here, enough space between everything, not only for the access paths, but also for light to get down and penetrate to the lower layers, because you want to grow things down on the lower layers too. And, you know, just go crazy with it. Like, just plant stuff, because you can always unplant it or cut it down later, or prune it. You can also limb up trees. You know, let's say you planted a big tree in the wrong spot. Well, you can either limb it up, so that's where you cut lower branches, or you can also top trees, where you basically just cut the top off. You've probably seen this under power lines, and it just keep it from growing higher. So those are different ways to manage the bigger trees. And then this is kind of also your genetic seed bank or mother colony that can then be used to like spread out to other parts of the site gradually. So remember, our gardens also contain our tree nursery, taking them from here and gradually planting them out. And so this is going to be the most heavily managed food forest, as well as the most biologically diverse. And if you're an urban site, then maybe this is all you have. You know, in another video, we'll zoom down into the details and talk about plant guilds or polycultures and companion planting and all the little tricks of the trade to get all this system to work. But right now I want to focus big picture and show you that there are many different types of food forests and that they function differently on your site. All right, so then the next ones I'm going to be getting into are a little more advanced: silvopasture and alley cropping, as well as orchards. So the first thing for us to look at here is contour lines. Okay, so contour lines is another way of representing slope. Like originally I used these arrows, but a more accurate way to represent the slope of a site is using a contour map. Essentially what contour lines represent is a line on the site that is at all the same elevation. So if you dug a trench along this whole thing and filled it with water, the water would sit all level on this line. They're usually the same elevation apart. So maybe, you know, this one is 330 feet above sea level, and maybe this is 340. So when they're closer together like this, it means that the slope is steeper, right? Because water doesn't run down these shapes, we can do a thing that's called contour farming. By planting out our contour lines, now it doesn't need to be right on the 10, it could be any interpolation. Now we'd want some access, right? Probably at the end of those rows. You know, the width is important. Generally, the general principle is alley widths are 1.5 to 2 times the height of the tallest tree. So if your trees here are 30 feet, then you want to do like 45 to 60 foot alleys. If you're using machinery or you have an animal pen that's a certain fixed width, like 16 feet wide, then that is probably what you want to use as kind of a general guide. Even though the contour lines might spread out like this, what you might do is kind of do something like that. In certain circumstances, you know, you can kind of like wiggle around the line a little bit. It doesn't need to be perfect, but you don't want a huge deviation. But that just gives you a little more consistency in the width. So by planting the trees on the contour line, you're essentially creating kind of a water catchment system, but this is basically, it protects against erosion and helps charge up the underground water supply, that big sponge that then helps feed streams and rivers. Now for your orchard, maybe over here, because it's a little harder to get to, maybe you're not going to go there as often. Essentially, you're going to fill in the alley, of course remembering the access paths on either side. This is definitely not to scale. Then you got alley cropping, so probably in the flattest part. So that is going to be crops planted in the alleys. So this could be sunflowers, it could be corn, it could be squash, it could be asparagus, but generally, you know, just it's going to be a simpler design pattern and mainly one big crop, which, yeah, generally we're against monocrops, but, you know, we're trying to do large-scale production while still gaining a lot of the ecological benefits. And because of the whole context of what is going on here, is creating very healthy overall ecosystem that is building soil and moderating the weather, moderating the wind and all that stuff, and having a lot of biodiversity on a site-wide scale. You know, having little patches of monocultures is going to be much less damaging and going to gain a lot of the benefits compared to if you just planted this whole thing out to one monoculture, which is more the conventional model. And that's alley cropping. So you're getting multiple yields. You're getting, you know, the crop in the alley and then the perennial tree crop as well. And then silvopasture is a similar concept, but you're mixing trees and pasture. So instead of crops in between the rows, you are going to have livestock. This might be on slightly more steep land or less ideal. You could even have your livestock going in your orchard to some degree. So maybe in here is your chickens and out here is your cows. Electric fencing. So that's going to move, right? The trees actually help provide additional shelter and protection from the wind and the sun, which can be really harsh on animals that are just out in the field, in the pasture. And yes, you generally don't let the animals into where the actual trees are planted, like in around their trunks. You just have them in the alleys, except in maybe certain unique short-term situations. Let's say you want to have pigs run under there to clean up the fallen chestnuts or apples at a certain time of the year. You could pen them actually in where the trees are. Once the trees are well enough established, I'm thinking at least 10 years old, you could let the pigs in there for a short amount of time and just watch them to the point where they clean up and eat up all the fallen fruit and nuts, but they aren't starting to damage and dig up the roots of the trees. Looks a little messy, but hopefully, because I walked through it all, it kind of makes sense how this all comes together and works as a whole food forest system. So yeah, so the trees out here in the alley cropping and silvopasture area. So you might just be managing it for, let's say, 3 main crops. You know, probably if this is commercial, you'd probably be doing around here, chestnuts, apples, and hazelnuts would be some of the big ones. With your orchard, these would be things I would want large volumes of. So again, apples, pears, plums, mulberry. Okay. So, there you go, kind of a crash course in food forest canopy design. So we haven't even really gotten into the understory yet, or the specific kind of layouts of these different systems, but we have a principle in permaculture called patterns to details. So we're starting out with the biggest, broadest patterns, and then we can zoom in from there and talk about the specifics and the details. But now you have kind of the context of how these little pieces fit into the whole system. And of course, there's a bigger system outside of this that includes your neighbors and community and the rest of the watershed, the climate system and the earth and the economy and industry and politics and policy that is also, you know, influencing and affecting the site. And those things are important to keep in mind as well. I think that's all I got for today. If you found this useful or helpful, please share a comment and a like. And if you want to see more stuff like this, then definitely remember to subscribe. And thanks for watching. Let's reforest the world.